Imagine this: a courtroom filled with tension, all eyes fixed on a white judge who is about to deliver a life-changing verdict. The defendant, a black man accused of a crime he insists he didn't commit. The gavel strikes, the judgment is passed, and their lives take different paths, or so it seems. But life has a way of turning tables in the most unexpected ways. Years later, the judge finds himself in a completely different position, stripped of authority, and now reporting to a familiar face. It's the same man he once condemned. What unfolds next is a story of redemption, reflection, and the surprising twists of fate that force us to confront our own biases. How will the judge cope with this reversal? And what lessons will emerge when power dynamics shift so drastically? Stay tuned for a story that challenges perceptions and explores the power of second chances. Years ago, the judge had been known for his stern demeanor and unwavering belief in the justice system. He prided himself on following the letter of the law, even when it meant making decisions that weighed heavily on his conscience. The black man who stood before him in that courtroom had pleaded his case with quiet desperation, insisting on his innocence. But the evidence, though circumstantial, painted a different picture, or so the judge believed at the time. The verdict was delivered, and the man's life took a sharp and devastating turn. What the judge didn't know was how much that decision would haunt him. The case was one of many, yet it lingered in his mind for reasons he couldn't fully explain. Meanwhile, the man he condemned had to rebuild his life from the ground up, driven by resilience and an unwavering determination to rise above the injustice. Their paths, seemingly so far apart, were now on a collision course. The day their paths crossed again was unexpected for both of them. The former judge, now working in a corporate office after stepping away from the courtroom, was introduced to his new supervisor during a team meeting. As soon as the man walked in, a wave of recognition hit them both. The judge froze, his confident demeanor replaced with unease, while the supervisor, calm and composed, extended a professional handshake, his eyes steady but unreadable. For the judge, it was like being thrust into a mirror of his past decisions, forced to face the weight of his choices. Memories of that trial came rushing back, more vivid than ever. He couldn't stop wondering how much this man remembered, and how much he resented. For the supervisor, this was an opportunity to show the strength he had built over the years. But there was more to his calmness than met the eye. Was he planning to confront the past or let his actions speak louder? The tension between them grew with each passing moment, leaving everyone in the room oblivious to the silent history that now loomed over their every interaction. As the weeks went by, the tension between them simmered beneath the surface. The former judge tried to keep his head down, focusing on his work, but the weight of his past decision pressed heavier with every passing day. He couldn't help but notice how his supervisor handled everything with grace, leading the team, solving problems, and earning the respect of everyone around him. Yet behind every polite exchange, there was an unspoken question hanging in the air. Does he remember everything? The supervisor, on the other hand, was deliberate in his actions. He never once mentioned the courtroom or hinted at their shared history, but his every interaction with the judge carried an undertone of quiet authority. The power dynamic had shifted entirely, and the former judge found himself in a position he'd never imagined, taking orders from the very man whose fate he had once controlled. Then came the moment that changed everything. During a late meeting, the two found themselves alone. The silence was heavy, the room thick with unspoken words. The supervisor finally broke it, his voice calm but piercing. "Do you ever think about the decisions you made back then?" he asked, his gaze steady. The judge hesitated, unsure whether to respond with honesty or deflection. The tension in the room was almost unbearable as the past finally began to surface, threatening to unravel everything. The judge hesitated, the question hanging in the air like a weight he couldn't shake. "I think about it more than I care to admit," he finally said, his voice quieter than he intended. The supervisor studied him, his expression unreadable, before leaning back in his chair. "Good," he replied, his tone calm but laced with something the judge couldn't quite place. Was it forgiveness or something darker? Before the judge could respond, the supervisor reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. He slid it across the table, his eyes never leaving the judge's face. "This might interest you," he said simply. The judge hesitated before opening it, his hands trembling. Inside were documents, detailed reports, testimonies, and new evidence from the trial that had haunted him for years. Evidence that suggested the man sitting before him had been innocent all along. The room seemed to close in around him as the truth